All right, hello everyone. We are finally back with another Zero to Hero video. It has been a while. I've been a bit busy. We actually bought a house since the last time we did a video, so that's exciting. Got a whole new, well, nothing's really new yet. We're still kind of upgrading and building things out, but we have a new office, new kind of studio, gaming room where I'm recording from. So very exciting changes, but today, let's dive in and do something a little new and a little bit more advanced, which is going to be interacting with databases. So databases are obviously a very important part of pretty much every FiveM server or any application in general, right? We need some place to store data about our players, about the world, about things like that. And the most common way that you're going to find that people do this in FiveM servers is with relational databases. So that's going to be like MySQL. And what we're going to do today is we're going to get everything set up that we need to start interacting with databases inside of our FiveM scripts and then write a script that interacts with the database. So the first thing that we need to talk about is how we're going to go about setting up a database server, which is necessary to have a database in your FiveM server. So you'll need much like if you were around back when TeamSpeak was a big thing, you had to have a TeamSpeak server alongside your FiveM server. Same situation here, you're going to need a database server alongside your FiveM server. And these can usually, in most cases, be ran on the same actual server, right? So if you're renting a server from somewhere, it may already come with a database server set up for you, or you may need to install it yourself. And then obviously when you're working locally, doing development on your computer, you'll need to install a database server. And so the database server that we're going to be using is called MariaDB, and it's an open source version of MySQL. So it's nearly one-to-one compatible with MySQL. You can kind of think of it as the exact same thing, just a little bit different underlying technology. And MariaDB is generally going to be the preference for projects like this. And you're going to have pretty much all of the same compatibility with MySQL. So we're going to use MariaDB for our database, and so I'm going to start by just downloading and installing MariaDB. Some tutorials out there, you might see them recommending things like XAMPP or WAMP to install just a database server, and that's totally overkill. You don't need a whole like web development environment just to run a database server. So we're going to install MariaDB directly because that's all we need. So from the MariaDB website, we will just hit download and select the version, operating system, and everything else that we need. In my case, I'm just going to go with, let's see, we'll probably use 10.11.2. That seems like the most stable version. And then for me, Windows x86 64, this is going to be pretty much probably the same for you. And we'll just hit download. And of course, once this is downloaded, we'll just install it like any other program. Accept the terms of the license. We can leave all of our defaults here, and it looks like in this case, it may install HeidiSQL for us. So HeidiSQL is basically just a client so we can interact with our database in kind of a visual GUI way. If you don't use MariaDB, if you just go straight to MySQL Community Edition or something like that, you may need to install HeidiSQL separately. Looks like for us, MariaDB is just going to throw it in as a nice bonus. So we don't need to worry about setting that up, but we will talk about that just in case. So your database has users. That's how the database is accessed. And by default, you will have a root user, and the root user is kind of the super user, administrator user that can access everything, manipulate everything. So we need to set up a password for our root user. In my case, I'm just going to make the password root. This is a local server. This isn't going to be accessed from the internet or anything like that. So I'm not too worried about being super high security here, but you might want to make this a more complex password. And you especially want to set up some more higher security features when you deploy this to production. And with that, we'll just hit next. And all of the settings here look good. Port 3306 is the default port for MySQL, so I'm happy with that. All right, and with installation complete, you'll notice that HeidiSQL has also been installed for us, and it's here on our desktop. So let's start there. Let's open HeidiSQL and start with that. So HeidiSQL is our SQL client that'll allow us to see the database to create tables and rows and columns and manipulate the data. And so when we first open it up, we'll need to set up the server that we want to connect it to. HeidiSQL is nice because you can have multiple different servers saved in here. So you could have your local server that you use for testing, and then also have a saved configuration for your production server. So if you ever needed to remotely connect to your live database server and poke at the data. It's pretty easy to do that from the client. Network type is already set to MariaDB or MySQL. That's great. The library that it's using is fine. The host name, this is 127.0.0.1 is localhost, so that's perfectly fine. User, root, like we talked about, and then the password, which I used root, so I'll type that in here. Port 3306, like we talked about, is the default. That's also what we chose when we set up MariaDB, and that should be all we need. So I'm just going to, double click and it connected. That's not exactly what I wanted. Let me just reopen this, and then I want to just rename this to localhost. So I know what this is. I'll retype my password and hit save. That way I've always got it handy. And now if I double click, we are into our server. So this is not a database. This is the server, and the server can have multiple databases in it. And you can see there are a couple databases here. These are things that are just kind of built into a MySQL server. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a database for our FiveM server or for our project. So if I right click on my server and go to create new and database, we can create a new database. And I'm just going to call this 0 to hero. And you can choose whatever you want. And then collation generally isn't going to be something you mess with a lot. I find that UTF-8 MB4 General CI works the best and has the best compatibility with most of the data that I'm putting into my databases. So I would start with some type of UTF-8 collation. I recommend UTF-8 MB4 General CI. And if we hit OK, you can now see over on the left, we have our 0 to hero database. And when we click into that, we don't have anything yet. It's empty. And so now is a good time to talk about what our project for today is. So the project that we're going to be building together today is a greeting system. And so when a player is playing on our server, they can use a command to set a custom greeting. And then every time after that they connect to the server, we will greet them with a chat message of whatever greeting they set up. And of course, we need a place to store this and a place to retrieve it from, which is what we're using a database for. So what we need to do is create a table inside of our database, and we'll start to see how relational databases work once we get this created. So just follow along with me now, and then once we have everything in here, we'll get a better picture of what a database looks like and how to think about it. So what I'm going to do is right click on my 0 to hero database and go to create new, and then create a new table. And I'm going to call this table greetings, okay? And then we have columns, and columns are where the data is going to be stored. You can think about a database a lot like an Excel sheet, right? With rows and columns. So I'm going to add my first column, and I'm going to call this column identifier, because when a player connects, we need a way to find their specific greeting from the database. And the way that we're going to do that is by using their FiveM license key, or not license key, but their FiveM license, which is an identifier. So we'll call it an identifier. And then we have data types, and data types basically just specify how the data is being stored. So like how in Lua we have integers and we have strings and we have tables, you also have data types in MySQL or in databases. And they're a lot more primitive. You don't have anything super complex like a table. But what we do have are things like integers, floats, text, binary, timestamps, and all of these are useful in the right cases. Now, for an identifier, we're going to use a varchar. And if you see here, HeidiSQL actually provides some really helpful information for you. So you can see that a varchar is a variable length string. And so we're going to select that, and then we're just going to set our length to 64. That seems like a nice sane default. And then we have some other options here. So allow null means that this can be empty. And in my case, the identifier will never be empty, so I'm going to uncheck that. And that's about all I need for my identifier column. Now, take a second and think about what other columns we might need. Well, one only comes to mind for me, and that's the greeting itself. So let's add that. We will add another column called greeting. And this one, they might want to have a long greeting. So I'm just going to crank this length up to 255. And once again, we'll always have a value for this. So we will just disallow null. Now at this point, this table and its columns haven't been created yet. So we need to make sure we hit save down at the bottom. And now you can see our greetings table shows up here. And if we look over here on the top and we go to the data tab, there's a lot of tabs in HeidiSQL, but you'll only be using a couple of them. So if we go to the data tab, this is our database table. And you can kind of see that it's starting to look like Excel, something that you're familiar with, right? You have these columns here, and then presumably you would have rows. So let's create a row. So I'll right click and go to insert row and then double click into identifier and just say ABC as an example and then test as a greeting. And in HeidiSQL, if you see this little red triangle in the corner, that means these changes haven't been saved yet. And so as soon as I click away, those changes are saved. And so now you can see we have a row and our columns. And something else that's really great about HeidiSQL, everything that it's doing through this user interface, it's just calling commands on the database server. The same way we'll be executing MySQL commands from our scripts. So if we look down at the bottom, we can actually see the command that it executed to create this. And we can see it's insert into the greetings table, identifier and greeting, and then the values are ABC and test. And remember this because we're going to use the same syntax in our own code in a bit. One thing that's really great about MySQL is the language that you talk to it in is pretty familiar. It's not far off from, well, it's pretty far off from how you would speak to someone in English, but it's pretty easy to reason about. If we look down here, line 71 in the console, where we got this greeting back out of the database, we select identifier, comma, greeting from database name dot table name, and then where specific things matched specific values. So while it might seem overwhelming right now, as you use this more and more, you'll find that there's really only a couple things you do in MySQL just over and over and over, and it's pretty plain English. It's pretty easy. So now that we have a basic idea of how these databases work, I'm just going to right-click and delete this row because we no longer need it. Now there's one other thing that's going to be very helpful to us in the future, and for that we need to jump back to our table tab and then go over to the indexes tab underneath that. So what is an index? An index basically tells the database server, hey, this column or this group of columns are how we're going to be looking to get data back out of this, right? So we don't want to, in the future when we're working on our script, every time someone connects, we don't want to get all of the greetings out of the database and then go through them trying to find the greeting for the specific player that has connected. We want to kind of offload that work to the database server. So we will ask the database server, give us the row where the identifier is equal to this player that just connected. And so what we need then is an index on identifier. Now this is not required. You can query for columns that do not have indexes, but your performance is going to be greater if those main columns that you're querying off of all the time do have indexes on them. And in addition to that, we're going to have a very special type of index here. And that's going to be a primary key index. So I'm going to add a new index, and I'm not going to bother naming it because it's actually going to name it for me when I go over to this type and set it to primary. Okay, and now that we have a primary key index, what we do is we take the identifier column and drag it up to primary key. And now we have set identifier as the primary key for this table. Don't forget to hit save down at the bottom to save those changes. And a primary key is actually going to be unique. So the database server will not let you have two rows with the same identifier. It'll throw an error. It won't let it happen. And that's important for us because obviously we're only going to have one greeting per player. But having this as the primary key is going to allow us to do something really neat when we're writing our code that I'll explain to you and save us a bunch of time and a bunch of lines of code. And with that out of the way, we can start writing some code. Well, almost. So what do we need to talk to a MySQL database in FiveM? Well, we need some type of MySQL library. Now, we could write it ourselves. That would be really stupid of us when there are some fantastic resources out there already. And one that you might already be familiar with is OxMySQL from Overextended. OxMySQL is very popular. I believe it's the default database adapter for QB Core. So I know this is used quite a lot. And they also have support for the same syntax that MySQL and mysql-async use, which is useful if you're making the jump over. So how do we set this up in our FiveM server? Well, the first thing to do would just be to download the latest release. So from the OxMySQL GitHub, I'll go to releases and I will download the latest. Now, if I just go into my FiveM server and open my resources folder, and of course, open my downloaded OxMySQL resource and just drag it in, we are good there. And before I forget, what I will do is I will just go to my resources config and make sure I add ensure OxMySQL. So MySQL starts up every time we start our FiveM server. Now there is a little bit of configuration here because we have to tell OxMySQL and by extension our FiveM server how to talk to our database server. So if we go to the OxMySQL documentation, and we go down to installation, we can see there are some configuration values that we have to put into our server.cfg. And you can use either one of these. I am going to use this first one as this is the pattern that I'm most comfortable with. So I will copy this. And then if we go to our server.cfg, and I'm just going to go down to the bottom and add a new section here called OxMySQL. And then I will paste that in, and I need to make a couple changes here. So the way that this configuration string is laid out is this first area before the colon is the username, and then you have the password, and then you have the host name, the port, / the database, right? So root was our username, root was our password, so I'll change that there. And this is localhost. This is our local computer that the database server is running on. As we talked about, our port is 3306, and then our database name we called 0 So that's what I'll put in there. You may have named your database something else. That's totally fine. And that's all we need for our setup there. Now, by this point, we've set up a bunch of resources before, so I'm not going to go in depth on how we set up a whole resource. What I do have is I have a resource called ch_greeting. And inside of that, I've got my client.lua inside of a folder called client and my server.lua inside of a folder called server, and then my fx manifest, which is all going to be pretty familiar if you've been following my tutorials thus far. There's only one thing that we have to change here, and that's going to be that we need to bring our OxMySQL library into our resource. And we do that here by including it in our server scripts. As you can see on line 6, we have oxmysql/lib/mysql.lua. And where I found this was in the overextended documentation. In usage, you can see right here how to use it in Lua. And now with that out of the way, let's talk about some other minimal setup that we have to do here. So like we discussed, we want to show a chat message when a player joins. And the way that I want to do that is I want to show that message once they've spawned into their PED. And for that, I do need to do a little bit of client-side work first, which you can see I've set up here. So I'm handling the player spawned event, which is generated by the spawn manager base resource. And then when player spawn happens, I'm triggering a server event called ch_greeting:show. So this is just some client-side setup that I had to do. So we have an event on the server that tells us when a player has spawned. Other than that, everything we're going to be doing today is going to be in our server script. So let's start with the server script and let's talk about how we want to build this out. Let's just scaffold it out first. So we know we need two things. We need a way for the player to set their greeting. And then of course we need to handle that event from the client, ch_greeting_show. I'm just going to copy that to my clipboard to make it easier here in a second. So we know we need to handle those two things. So let's register our command, and we're going to have a command, and I'm just going to call it setGreeting. Seems like an easy enough command. And then of course we have our source, args, and raw command, which the source and raw command will be important here. So there's our command sorted out. And then of course we need to handle this net event from the client like this. And I can make things a little bit bigger here just to help you out if you're on a small screen. All right, so let's start with the entry point, which is how we set our greeting. There's a couple things we need here. So like we talked about, we need that player identifier, right? Because that's how we're going to store things in a database. Our source, or our player ID, changes every time the player connects, so we can't rely on that. So we're going to use the client license, and we can use a really handy native that was just recently added. I believe, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting this, I think it was Avarian Knight who proposed and got this added. But this is a new native that I'm a fan of called getPlayerIdentifier_by_type. So previously, if you wanted to get a player's specific identifier like their license or their Discord ID, you would have to iterate through all of them. It was really annoying. And we now have this really handy native getPlayerIdentifier_by_type that just lets us give it a player ID and then the type of identifier we want, like license or Discord or Steam, and get it back very easily. I'm just going to switch this over to Lua so I copy paste easier. And we will use this native, which takes the player source and an identifier type, which as we discussed, we're going to use license. So I will just, actually let's call this identifier. I'll create a variable called identifier, and we will use this native and pass in the source and then license, which is the type of identifier that we want. And then the other thing that we need is the greeting. Now the greeting is multiple words, or we're going to assume it's multiple words with spaces. So args, which normally puts things in a nice little table for us, is probably not going to work. The way that I'm going to use this is using the actual raw command. Now, one gotcha with the raw command is that this will include the set greeting, right? So we need to kind of lop that off the beginning. So I'm going to create a new variable called greeting, and I'm going to do string.sub, and then I'll pass in our raw command. And then set greeting is 11 characters long, plus we have a space, and then we want the first character of the greeting. So we actually need 13. So 11 plus 1 for the space gives us 12 plus 1 for the first character of our actual greeting. So 13 is going to be our first value here in sub, and we can leave. There is a third one that you can use to kind of lop the end off. We don't want to do that. We're just lopping the beginning of this string off. So now we have our identifier and our greeting, and now we get to write a MySQL query. So let's jump into the OxMySQL documentation and kind of look at our usage here and see, let's just take a guess, see which one seems most relevant to us. And it seems like it's pretty obvious here, right? Insert is what we want to do. We want to insert something into the database. So there's some great examples in here, and we're going to type this out ourselves, and we'll kind of talk through it as we go. So if we go mysql.insert, and now here is where we are going to write our SQL query. And the way an insert query works is we say insert into, and then we give it the table name. Remember, we're already working in the context of a database. We specified our database here in our SQL connection string. So we're already kind of in the context of the database, and all we need to do is specify the table. And I think we called this table greetings. So we will say insert into greetings, and then in parentheses, we want to give it the column names that we are inserting data into. So identifier and greeting. And then we want to give it the values. So that is using the values keyword, and then in parentheses, what we're going to do here is instead of kind of concatenating these into it, we're going to give question marks. And question marks basically tells OxMySQL, replace these with something else I'm going to give you, okay? And then after that, what we will do is give it a table with those values. So identifier and greeting. So OxMySQL will take this first question mark and replace it with the value, the first value in this table that we gave it. And then it'll take the second one and replace it with the second value. Now, there is one fatal flaw here so far. When we were setting up the database, we talked about how by setting up that primary key, an identifier could only ever exist in the database once. We can't have multiple rows with the same identifier. And if we're just inserting into greetings over and over and over, if someone updates their greeting, well, this isn't going to work because we're trying to add another row with an identifier that already exists. So how do we get around that? Well, there's a pretty naive approach that we could take, which would be to maybe query the database first, right? We can ask the database, hey, does this identifier exist? And if it says no, then we know we're safe to insert. And if it says yes, then we could either use an update command or we could do a delete command and then another insert command. But that's a lot of logic. That's fragile. It could break. I'm not a huge fan of it. But what there is in MySQL and MariaDB is a on duplicate key that we can use, that we can basically say, hey, if this insert would result in a duplicate key, do this instead. And so let's talk about how we write that out. So at the end of this, we can just say on duplicate key update. So if it runs into a duplicate key, which remember, this is our identifier as our primary key, then we want to update the row instead of create a new one. And what do we want to update the row? Well, all we want to do is we want to update greeting to be equal to something, right? So greeting is equal to question mark. And then because we have a third question mark here, we need to add it. And this feels a little silly, but we need to add it again down here in our table because we have 3 question marks in our query and we have 3 values in our table. And now we're done with our insert query. Now, one thing that's important to point out about OxMySQL is this is by default an asynchronous library. So what that means is something here, we'll just call that 1, and then down here, something here 3. Now, normally these would be executed in order, right? If imagine this was some kind of code logic. This would execute, and then this would execute, and then this would execute. But because these MySQL commands can sometimes take a bit of time, this is asynchronous. So if as soon as this is called, it will immediately move on to working on this, even if this hasn't finished yet. So there's a couple things we can do here to make this synchronous. The MySQL library, or this library, if we just take a look at it, if we just add .await, this will make it kind of synchronous again. And it will actually wait for this to finish before it moves on. And that's how we might get an ID here. But asynchronous is good enough for me. And what we actually have is a third parameter here, which is a function. And this function will be called once this insert finishes. So I'm just going to clean this up here and here. And then inside of this function, this logic will only be called once this query is finished. So I'm just going to do a trigger client event, chat add message to the source, and we will just send a chat message letting the player know that their custom greeting has been saved. So once this insert command finishes, this runs, which sends a client event, trigger client, that wouldn't be right, trigger client event that says, hey, your greeting has been saved. All right, and now that we have the ability to set greetings, let's go ahead and connect to the server and test this. Let's make sure it works. I just pulled up my FiveM client and connected to the server, and then one thing that we need to do real quickly is just make sure that our ch greeting resource is turned on. And if I go here and I go set greeting, and I'll just say hello YouTube, and hit enter, and hey, we got some feedback. Our greeting has been saved. Now, has it been saved? Let's go back to HeidiSQL. And if we go back up to the data column, or the data tab up at the top, you'll see we do have a greeting in here. And you can see the identifier is our license. And then we have our greeting of hello YouTube. So that all looks perfect. And let's try to update this. And let's say hello Discord. Set our greeting to that. Go back to the database. If you right click and then hit refresh down here, we can see that our greeting has been updated. So we know that our on duplicate key logic is working as well. Now, just for example's sake, let's take this out real quick and then save the resource, and let's see what happens. We'll say hello Twitter. Oh boy, we got an error. So that's why we have this on duplicate key update greeting, which is perfect. All right, so now we can move on to the show event, which is where we want to show our greeting. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the player ID from the magical source variable into a variable called player ID, and then we need to get their identifier again. So same thing as before, we'll get player identifier by type, we'll pass in the player ID and then license. We want to make sure we're consistent here. Now, how are we going to get this data back out of the database? Well, there's a couple things that we could do, and let's just jump back to the documentation, and we can kind of guess from this list, maybe query is what we need. We want to query something, and this looks, we got some select stuff here, and this looks reasonable. So let's try this. We'll do MySQL.query, and we'll write our query, and we're going to do select, and then what we want is the greeting, right? So we're going to select the greeting from greetings, and then where. So what data are we looking for? What are we keying off of? And of course, here we say identifier is equal to our question mark, and then we give it a table with our identifier. And then once again, since this is asynchronous, we need a function that returns or runs after the query is finished. And if we give it, if we accept a results, or you can name this variable anything you want, I'm going to name it results. If we have that results parameter, then any results from our query will come back here. So maybe we'll just do a print JSON encode results, and let's see what comes back. And yes, I'm using JSON encode because I know what's going to come back. And then maybe just for testing sake, in our client, we will add a command called test greeting that triggers the same server event of ch_greeting : show, just so we have an easy way to test this so we don't have to constantly disconnect and reconnect from the server. So I will restart my script, and let's run. Oh, you know what? I am missing something. In my manifest, I am missing my client scripts. So let me add that really quick. Now I will refresh and restart. And if we call test greeting and we look back at our server console, you can see that we got a table back. So when we query this, what we're going to get is we're going to get a table back that looks like, just do this so we get decent syntax highlighting. We're going to get a table that looks something like this. And we're gonna have a table of tables. And so let's say we're getting a list of vehicles that someone owns. This might be what we want because we're gonna have multiple rows for the same person in that case, right? One person might own 5 cars, so we're gonna get 5 rows back. And then each of these rows is going to have multiple data in it. Maybe it'll have the model and it'll have the color, right? So in this case, we might want to get a table like this back so we can iterate through it, get all the values out of it. But in this case, we're really only getting one value. We literally just want the greeting, and we know there'll only be one identifier. What we really want here is we just want to get a string back. And fortunately, there's a very easy way to do this, but it's not a very intuitive name. And what we're actually looking for here is a scalar. A scalar is going to just return the single value that we ask for. And this example is almost exactly what we need, right? We're going to call scalar, and we're just going to select one column, and then a specific, in this case, identifier. So let's adapt our code a little bit there, and we will change this from query to scalar, and then I'm just going to rename this from results to greeting. And then if we print greeting and restart our resource, hopefully what we would see is just our greeting comes back. Okay, there we go. Hello, Discord. And let's just, for example's sake, go back into HeidiSQL and delete this so we don't have a greeting anymore. And let's see what happens. We get nil back. So now we know this is really easy to build out from here. All we have to do is say, if not greeting, then return. We obviously don't want to do anything if the person doesn't have a greeting, but assuming they do, we will trigger a client event, do chat, add message, make sure to send it to that player, and return their greeting, just like this. Perfect. So if we restart our resource again, now remember, we deleted that row, so right now we don't have anything. And if I call test greeting, nothing happens. But if I do set greeting, and we'll just say foobar, and now we run test greeting, you can see that our greeting shows up in the chat. So let's go ahead and disconnect from the server and reconnect and see if we get our greeting when we connect. All right, we just connected, and if you look in the chat bar, you see we got our foobar back. So we know that that is working. All right, and that's going to be it, I think. We've got a insert and kind of an on-duplicate key update. So we've got what we would commonly refer to as an upsert, and we have a way to query that back out of the database and show it to the user. And so our project is complete. Now, like usual, I do have some homework for you. And if you want to take this a little bit further, the idea that I came up with is to make a player statistics table and maybe show that to the user every time they connect. So maybe you find a way to track how many times a player has connected, and then each time they connect, it tells them, hey, this is the 3rd time you've connected to our server. This is the 10th time you've connected to our server. Or if you want to make it even more advanced, maybe tell them what their playtime is. So you can track how long they stay connected to the server, keep that in the database, and then each time they can connect, you can tell them, hey, you've played on the server for 20 hours this month. That's obviously getting into kind of more complex territory. You've got to track connection and disconnect times, handle restarts. That's a challenging project, but it's, I think, fulfilling and maybe something that might actually be useful in your server. But if you want to keep it simple, maybe just keep track of how many times they've connected and tell them that each time they connect. That should be pretty simple to accomplish. So take this, practice it over and over and over. Explore MySQL documentation, look at tutorials specific to MySQL, because MySQL is a world much, much bigger than FiveM. Understand all the powerful things you can do with it. Then come back, try to build that connection counter, and then let me know how it goes. Drop a comment down below. Maybe share some code on like a GitHub gist or gist, or drop it in my Discord. I'm always there. So come share what you've built in the Discord. And then if you found this database stuff really interesting and you want to learn more about data persistence in FiveM, the best thing you can do is subscribe, because later this week, I have a master series that I do that dives into more advanced FiveM topics. And later this week, we have a new master series video coming out about KVP, which is a way to persist data in your FiveM server without a MySQL database. Now, it's a lot less powerful and has a lot less features, but there are good reasons to use it in some cases. So make sure you hit that subscribe button and, of course, the bell icon so you get notified. And then later this week, keep an eye out for the Master Series. And that's going to just take this knowledge of data persistence and take it to the next level. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. The link to my Discord is down below. Be sure to join. There's a ton of helpful people there. I also build some resources. I do live streams and 3D modeling. There's a lot of stuff going on. And now that we're kind of settled into the new house, I'm trying to get back into, the routine of working on this stuff, creating fantastic content for you guys, interacting in the community, getting back on Twitch. So make sure you get involved in the community, hit subscribe, all that good stuff. And we'll see you in the next video.